8B, information item, our consultant review of CalPERS divestments. And Bienvenue, introduce your team members here.
All right, thank you, Mr. Miller. As mentioned in the opening comments, this is our annual consultant review of CalPERS divestment, the economic impact of divestment as required by the total fund investment policy. So Daniel Ingram is joining us from Wilshire to lead us through the discussion. Daniel, over to you.
I think you're muted, Dan.
Daniel, your mic is showing as muted. Are you able to enable your video and unmute?
Sorry about that. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, good. For some reason, the usual icons have deserted me, so I apologize. Can't seem to find my video icon. Find camera. I'm in the settings. Normally, there's just a simple icon to toggle at the bottom of my screen, but they seem to have left me. Connect to video system. No. Okay, well, we'll just have to proceed with audio until someone maybe can point me to. I'm in the toolbar at the top of the page, but for some reason the normal camera icon, I can't see it, but I don't know why that is. Okay, let me just carry on. Thank you, Dan. Good afternoon, everybody. Daniel Ingram, Senior Vice President for Responsible Investment at Wilshire Associates. We'll go straight to slide 2, if I may, please. Just to outline, as many of you are aware, the Total Fund Investment Policy outlines 2 divestment-related actions. Firstly, every 5 years, staff conduct a deep dive investment review, and that looks at the broader investment risks and opportunities within each of the different divestment areas for a determination of whether to continue. But today we're not discussing that broader review. Staff are due to undertake a review of all divestment programs in 2021. And so we'll be providing information as part of next year's deep dive. Today, we're presenting an annual snapshot. So it's an annual financial impact divestment analysis. So it's got a more limited scope to the 5-year deep dive. So we're just purely concerned today to look at the financial gains and losses through to June of this year, the fiscal year to June 2020, for each of the different divestment programs. And this presentation provides you with updated numbers covering 2 different time periods. Time period 1 covers the period since each divestment program was last affirmed, and time period 2, we go back over a longer period, analyzing the impacts since each divestment program began. First, a quick note on methodology. Our analysis is based on comparing the returns of the unconstrained portfolio to the 6 constrained portfolios. So by way of reminder, that's tobacco, EM principles, Sudan, Iran, firearms, and thermal coal. By way of reminder, the Sudan, Iran, and thermal coal divestments are mandated by state law, and the tobacco, emerging equity market principles, and assault-style weapons are implemented pursuant to CalPERS board's direction. On slide 3, we discussed this last year in response to the question, what happens to the divested dollars? So we thought we'd provide some clarity here with an illustrative example of how tobacco divested assets are reinvested on a pro rata basis, in this case, across the IT and utility industries. So in this example, we're assuming that IT and utility industries have higher returns than the tobacco industry. And so as a result of divesting from tobacco, which is held in the unconstrained benchmark, as a result of divesting and moving into the constrained benchmark, of reinvesting those tobacco assets into those higher returning industries, the decision to divest from tobacco would have led to improved performance. So in this case, the unconstrained benchmark with tobacco has 10%, but the constrained benchmark has 10.15%, leading to a gain of 15 basis points. And we talked last year that that gain would show up in the PERF's annual performance. So just bear that in mind when we're talking about these gains and losses, that's where they show up in the PERF's annual performance. For time period 1, since last affirmation, slide 5, if we could switch to slide 5, please. Thank you. You'll see that CalPERS divestment programs have delivered positive gains since they were last affirmed by the board, with a total gain of 2.376 billion, gained as a result of not being invested in these 6 areas. The largest gain of $856 million came from the tobacco divestment program, since that was last affirmed, as you can see, Q1 2017, that was last affirmed in December 2016. Other notable gains since their last affirmation include the EM principles, providing a gain of 688 million, and thermal coal, as a result of not being invested in thermal coal, that has also led to a gain, in this case, of $348 million. Now, time period 2, if I may look to the appendix on slide 7. This tells a different story. As you can see, the tobacco divestment program was started way back in Q1 of 2001. And as you can see, taken together, since inception, the divestment programs have led to a loss of $2.18 billion in present value terms. So while the 5 of the divestment programs since inception have delivered gains, the tobacco program goes back a much longer period, over 20 years, and in of itself has delivered a loss of $3.692 billion. And then I'll just conclude this presentation by pointing to the appendix, which contains annual impacts over a longer period for each divestment program. So, for example, slide 8 shows the tobacco divestment impacts over time. Despite the positive gains from being divested from tobacco since 2016 that we just talked about since the last inception, that was the period when the tobacco industry underperformed. You can see there's a lot of ground to make up for the losses that were accumulated as a result of not being invested in the tobacco industry when it performed relatively well during the time period 2001 to 2015. The fund lost money almost every year apart from 2013. And on that note, I'll hand back to the chair to see if there are any questions about our report.
Okay, I have a question from Director Perez.
Dan, when do we hear the deep dive? When is that presented to us?
I don't know the exact timing next year, but it's probably going to be towards the end of next year, I believe, the deep
I'm sorry,
dive.
Mr. Ingram. That was for Dan Bienvenu.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, Mr. Perez, I believe it's this meeting next year. I believe it's the November meeting in 21.
Okay, so
I think, excuse me, I think we have it scheduled for earlier than that, Dan, but we can talk offline, but I believe it's the first quarter, no later than second quarter next year.
because I'm not, help me out. Am I able to make a motion to lift the tobacco divestments right now today?
I think we may have a notice issue to take that type of action today, but let's have Matt Jacobs weigh in on that.
Yeah, that type of motion would be beyond what this particular item is noticed for, which is consultant review of CalPERS divestment. So if you think about it in terms of notice to the public, it's not really telling them that kind of thing could be done today. But if you wanted to, you could certainly make a motion to place it on a calendar earlier than otherwise be scheduled, earlier than it's otherwise scheduled for.
I think, Marcy, I think if it's for quarter one of our next investment meeting in March, I think you said, then I can wait till then. If you guys would, there's a great article in the Orange County Register yesterday. 96, I took notes, 99 cities had local tax measures on their ballots to try to increase tax revenue to pay off their pension obligations. My city, the city of Corona, is looking into a combination of hybrid between an obligation bond and a 115 trust to lower that. And as Mr. Ingram said, in the last several years, that tobacco has done bad. And my interest in bringing this up is not to strong arm our investment office into investing into tobacco or into any of the divestments that we currently have. They're the professionals, I am not. My interest is to taking the handcuffs off the investments in which our investment office can dip into when they see, or if they see fit.
Yeah.
If there's nothing I can do between now and next meeting, then so be it.
Yeah, I think just getting committee direction, Dan and I obviously have not had a chance to coordinate on this, but my understanding the last time we spoke to the board, I gave an update to the board, is that we were going to bring those back in March. So if that's changed, Dan and I need to reconnect, but perhaps we can just get committee direction on how quickly you'd like that those decisions to be brought back.
I'm not a shot caller on the committee, but
when I look at the item for the agenda for calendar 2021, it is currently sitting on November. But I do think that the analysis is a fairly deep dive, so there is a fair amount to do there. But I do think that we could bring it back in more.
Here's my concern about waiting till November is we're going to start the ALM cycle, and I mean 3 almost 1% of the fund. That's kind of a lot of money. Not to say we're going to get that back tomorrow, or even ever, but I want those handcuffs taken off so y'all can determine what's good. So first quarter.
Yeah, we can take that as committee direction if that's the committee's wish.
Yeah, so what would be the direction to move from November to March?
That would be to move
be
the
practical
5-year.
for staff, or should we move it, maybe sooner than November? But what would be the time to allow your staff to actually do, the necessary work? I'm open to the direction that it happens sooner, but March is, that's right around the corner, and if you didn't have it on your calendar, how's that going to happen?
why don't we take it as direction for March? If for some reason there's enough there, we know we have a committee meeting in February. In February, if we're not going to make March, if for some reason the analysis is too much, but my sense is that it's doable by March. We just need to shift a couple of things.
Okay.
We can accelerate it.
You're comfortable with that, then I would say that we'll take that as committee direction then.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. We'll take that as committee direction.
Anything else, Director Perez?
No, sir.
Okay. Any other questions or comments before I go to the public comment? Okay, Mr. Fox, I believe we have at least one public comment on this item, 8B.
Yes, Mr. Chair, we have 3 callers on item 8B. The first, Mr. Bijan Mariar of the League of California Cities.
Good afternoon. Can you all hear me?
Mr. Mariar? Yes. Carry on.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Fox and board members. Bijan Mariar with the League of California Cities. I just want to take the time to appreciate board member Perez's comments about the dire straits that many local governments find themselves in, having to resort to tax increases and pension obligation bonds to help fund their pension obligations. Now, I'm not here to take any position on any of the individual divestments, but we do think it's important to emphasize that the investment office needs the freedom and the ability to creatively achieve their goal of meeting the 7%. And I think when you all as a board evaluate this report, it's important to consider that every investment loss, every inability to hit that 7% ultimately means that employers are going to have to pay more. So I highly encourage you, as you consider other divestment proposals that may come up in the near future or in the longer term, to remember that any type of politicalization of the fund, any investment decision-making that is separate from the goal of achieving 7% or your fiduciary duty to meet your obligation is going to impact the employer ability to pay. And when the employers cannot pay, that's when we will find ourselves in even dire straits than we're already in. So thank you very much for the opportunity to comment, and I appreciate your careful consideration of the impact of the divestment policies on the PERF. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Fox.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Next, we have Dylan Gibbons of the California Special Districts.
Thank you. Thank you. This is Dylan Gibbons with the California Special Districts Association. Thank you, Mr. Fox, and Chair and members of the committee. CSDA believes that divestment as an investment strategy can present challenging conflicts for CalPERS in balancing current affairs against its fiduciary duty to maximize retirement investments. CSDA supports CalPERS' priority to its members as stated in the State Constitution, Article 16, Section 17. A retirement board's duty to its participants and their beneficiaries shall take precedence over any other duty. We would oppose any efforts that would divert CalPERS from its duty to its members, including divestment of CalPERS assets to achieve political objectives if the divestment would have a negative impact on the overall health of the fund. We support CalPERS' proxy access efforts to affect change from within businesses CalPERS has invested in to ensure that they are well managed for sustained long-term success. So I want to echo the comments that my colleague from the League of Cities made and just encourage you to listen to your investment staff who has advised you that divestment is a bad investment strategy. If there's money to be made, go ahead. But to simply achieve a political objective using the retirement funds and having employers, employees, and retirees pay for that, I believe would violate your fiduciary duty. With that, thank you and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Fox, our next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Our last caller on item 8B is Mr. Rick Lebeski with the California Association of Highway Patrol Officers.
Hi, Mr. Fox. Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, sir. Go ahead. Carry on.
Oh, okay. Perfect. Hey, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Fox and board, for the time and opportunity to address you folks. Again, this is Rick Lebeski, president of the California Association of Highway Patrolmen. And I would just like to say on behalf of the 14,000 active and retired members of the California Association of Highway Patrolmen, I'm taking your time to express my support for CalPERS reevaluating its divestment policies to ensure that the pension funds earn the highest rate of return possible on its investments. Now more than ever, we rely on CalPERS board members to exercise their fiduciary duties to ensure that the fund reaches its goals for return on investment. In the current environment, when achieving returns is so difficult, we do not believe it's appropriate to be divested from legal investments for political reasons, particularly when those divestments are determined to have resulted in lost opportunities for returns, as was reflected in the most recent report to the investment committee. We request that CalPERS board act quickly to reevaluate its divestment policies to ensure that all paths for legal investments are available to the fund, and to ensure that the fiduciary responsibilities of the board are carried out on behalf of all CalPERS members. Again, I want to thank you on behalf of the California Association of Highway Patrolmen, and would like to thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir. Is that all of our commenters on this item, Mr. Fox?
That concludes public comment on item 8B.
Okay, moving along then. I don't see anything else. Okay, so moving on to item 8C, climate change risk strategy.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Jared, if we could please move Daniel Ingram back to the Indy room, and if we could please move Ann Simpson and Divya Mankikar forward to our to the presenter queue. And Ann, I'll turn it over to you to take us from there.
Yes, thank you very much, Dan. And very nice to be back again. Ann Simpson from the Investment Office for the Board and Governance Sustainability Team, which reports to Marcy. So it's my pleasure today to introduce our update to the board on climate change risk strategy. This was requested at the last investment committee meeting. And what we've been able to do is give you the outline of the strategy itself, and then a progress report on each of the elements. So I'm delighted to, excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold. So Divya Mankikar, who's our climate change in-house expert, is going to take you through the details of this progress report, but I just want to set the scene. The first to say is that our work on sustainability is driven by our fiduciary duty, and it really is rooted in CalPERS investment beliefs, which were referenced earlier by Michael Krim when he was talking about risk. I want to start by focusing on investment belief number 4, where CalPERS recognizes that long-term value creation requires effective management of 3 forms of capital. Financial capital, of course, but also human capital and physical capital. And it's with that framing in our beliefs that we started a research exercise a while back under the Sustainable Investment Research Initiative to really look at all the evidence about what really mattered to risk and return with that idea of the 3 forms of capital. Climate change really rose to the surface in being an issue which was relevant across the total fund in terms of us thinking about both risk and also about opportunity. So the strategy for our sustainable investment strategy, which the CalPERS board adopted 4 years ago, was to say we have 3 channels of influence in pursuing an agenda on climate change and the other priorities in that strategic plan. The first is engagement, and this is where we're using our position as a part owner of companies and also as a provider of capital. We're able, through partnership, to work with others to really work with companies to bring the transition forwards that we see that's going to be important for those companies thriving in the long term, particularly with the transition that's necessary for many sectors because of the impact of climate change. And our flagship project there is Climate Action 100 Plus. Divya will say more about that. Our second channel of work is advocacy. This is where we as a fiduciary can raise our voice with regulators and policymakers to make sure that we have the rules in the marketplace to ensure that we're able to manage risk and to find opportunities. And again, we've had tremendous progress there, both looking at the issue of risk reporting by companies, which is very important to our assessment of both risk and opportunity, and also matters like carbon pricing. There's been great progress on both fronts, which is very encouraging. And thirdly, and this is really great credit to our asset classes, because we take a total fund approach, we've said integration is the third channel of our work on sustainable investment. And on the integration work, each of our asset classes has developed an approach which is specific to their particular situation. And the approach that they're taking, we've provided for you in this presentation, and also we've got links for you to their sustainable investment practice guidelines. Finally, even though CalPERS is so very big, everything that we do has to be done in partnership. So the theme of partnership runs right through this work, and through partnership, not only do we learn from others, we're able to pool influence, pool resources, further our own understanding of what needs to be done by working with others. And the groups that we work with are an extremely important part of the progress that we're starting to make. We see that through the UN, through the Vatican Council on Care for Our Common Home, through our membership of bodies like Ceres and the PRI and others. So let me turn to Divya now to take you through the details. We've also provided links along the way to the many reports and initiatives that she'll be referencing so that you can see more about what we're doing if you want to do a deeper dive. So with that, let me turn to Divya.
Thank you, Anne. So I will go through, as Anne said, the presentation and each of those three pillars of activity in a bit more detail. And of course, we're always happy to stop and respond to any questions you may have. If we go to the next slide, please, you have an overview here where we'll briefly review the portfolio context as it relates to the subject of our climate strategy, and then go into each one of those three pillars. So on the next slide, what you have is a quote, next slide please, yeah, from the US National Climate Assessment, which came out just a couple of years ago, which states that climate change creates new risks and exacerbates existing vulnerabilities in communities in the US, presenting growing challenges for human health, safety, quality of life, and importantly for this discussion, the rate of economic growth. So what that means is scientific experts here, economists, have been able to model the impact of climate change on economic growth. And this is really where our climate change integration strategy is grounded. The fact that climate change does impact our portfolio companies and the economies in which we invest, and as well as their return and growth profiles. In addition, CalPERS declared last year that climate change is one of the top 3 risks to our fund. So as we go to the next slide, we think about our approach to climate change, it's helpful to keep in mind the characteristics of our portfolio. So as of June 30th, 2020, our portfolio, or the PERF rather, was $389 billion, about 80% of that in public markets, the remainder in private. And the majority of our fund is internally managed. So this is important to consider when we think about how to integrate climate factors into enhance our investment decisions. It largely is dependent on whether we're looking at our own decision making and we're looking at internally managed portfolios, whether we're evaluating external managers, and whether our approach is index oriented or we're taking active risk. So all of those factors come into play in terms of the specific activities of an asset class to integrate climate and other sustainability considerations. So going to the next slide, as you'll recall, in June, we presented our first report on our climate strategy that aligned with an international framework for climate reporting called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD. And in that report, we disclosed that according to the 4 TCFD sectors listed here on this slide, roughly 21% of our total fund is invested in those sectors and therefore more acutely exposed to climate-related risks. Going to the next slide, we think about climate change not just purely as a risk, but also as an opportunity. And again, in our TCFD report, we found that about $12 billion as of December 31st was invested, in private asset classes, was invested in quote-unquote climate solutions, renewable energy, and sustainably certified buildings. We're thinking about this not just from a risk lens, but also where can we invest our assets where we're seeing opportunities climate solutions. So going to the next slide. Our investment top organized around 3 pillars: engagement, advocacy, and integration. And this is not just for climate change, but other sustainability factors. All of our work here is really much more impactful when we leverage partners. And so that underpins our strategy. So with this background, I'd now like to turn with a little bit more detail related to our efforts in each of these pillars. So going to slide 9 on engagement, you've heard from us before that our premier endeavor on the engagement front is Climate Action 100+. And actually, coincidentally, it was exactly 5 years ago that I first presented to this board when I had just joined CalPERS on our carbon footprint, the first CalPERS carbon footprint, where we looked at global equity and found that a subset of the more than 10,000 companies that we invest in, about 80 at that time, were responsible for half of our global equity portfolio's emissions. We then took those results to peers and found that they had a similar exposure. And as you know, that led us to co-found the launch of Climate Action 100+. Climate Action 100+ it has a focus on net zero emissions and engaging a target list of companies that are the systemically important carbon emitters. What we found in running the analysis related to our TCFD report earlier this year is that if we just looked at the scope 1 and 2 emissions of the top 100 companies on the Climate Action 100+ list, they would become the 3rd largest global emitter after China and the US. So what that means is we have an opportunity to significantly impact emissions leveraging our tool of engagement. And we believe that that benefits not just our global equity portfolio, but has benefits across the portfolio as emissions reductions mitigates the climate risk to our total fund. In terms of activities, we engage 22, or rather we lead engagement for 22 of the companies on the Climate Action 100+ list and support peer asset owners engagement teams by running proxy solicitations on a number of others. And so far in the nearly 3 years since we launched Climate Action 100+, over 50 companies have set aims to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 or sooner. If we go to the next slide, I'll just briefly remind you that the goals of Climate Action 100+ are threefold. They are to have governance oversight at the board level for each of these companies on the list, that the company set emission targets in line with a net zero by 2050 target, and that they disclose their climate strategy to us, as well as implementation of that reduction target through TCFD style disclosure. If we go to the next slide, then I know I'm going relatively quickly through these because we did cover some of this in June, so want to make sure we have time for the integration portion as well. But here you have two case studies amongst those 50 companies that have set emission reduction targets. And the reason we pulled these two companies out is that Duke Energy is an energy consumer in being a utility, and BP is an energy producer. And the point here is really that there are so many interrelationships within the economy. It isn't just one industry or sector where we're looking for emissions reductions, but really there's a dependence between industries. And so we have a holistic approach within Climate Action 100+ and within our broader CalPERS strategy to consider climate in our investment decisions. So then going to the next pillar, if we can flip to slide 13. The second pillar of our strategy is advocacy. And CalPERS holds board and advisory positions with several financial regulators and policy setters at both the international and the federal level. On the following slides, you have those entities that we have such positions with or have engaged in recent years. So I won't go through each and every one. But broadly speaking, our goals are to advocate for policies that enable a low carbon transition, again, to mitigate the financial risk to our portfolio of climate change. And key policies that we advocate for are carbon pricing, removing fossil fuel subsidies, and mandatory climate risk reporting. One element that is new since we reported to you in June is the report from the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which I believe is on the slide after this one. There you go. And CalPERS was selected to be one of the 35 members of the Climate Subcommittee to the Market Risk Advisory Committee of the CFTC. The CFTC's role, which stands for Commodities Future Trading Commission, is to, as it says, regulate the trading of commodity futures, for example, oil and agricultural commodities. And this was a significant effort because it's the first time a U.S. financial regulator convened such a committee to and really put energy into examining the links between climate change and the U.S. economy. After a one-year consultation process with these 34 other members that represented finance, industry, and civil society organizations, the subcommittee adopted a report unanimously, which you have as an attachment to this item, which found that, again, climate change does, in fact, impact the U.S. financial system. And on the next slide, I believe you have a quote which says, "Climate change poses a major risk to the stability of the U.S. financial system and to its ability to sustain the American economy, which again underpins the activities that we have to think about climate change as an investment risk and opportunity factor. And so finally, on advocacy, we also wanted to talk briefly about our work at the state level. We're proud of California's leadership on climate change and to have had the opportunity to work with the governor's office on their recent executive order, which created a climate investment framework. The framework advances efforts to establish climate change as a financial risk. And we worked with CalPERS, the UC funds, and several departments within the governor's office to create this framework, which also happens to align with our investment beliefs and our sustainable investment strategy. So we think that's a good collaboration that has, landed in a place that aligns with CalPERS strategy. Sorry, I said that was the final one on advocacy, but actually we have one more than mentioned there on the international front, which is CalPERS pushed for climate risk reporting at the international level by engaging the International Accounting Standards Board, or IASB, which oversees the development of financial reporting standards for basically every country outside of the US. And so clearly they have a very broad and impactful remit to impact financial disclosure from companies around the world. Our team was able to work with the IASB on research that established that the TCFD reporting that CalPERS has put out in June that we're asking for Climate Action 100 plus companies is actually already embedded in the current standards, supporting the concept that companies can already be reporting on their climate strategy. Okay, so now let's turn to the third and final pillar. I won't go through all of the slides here to leave time for your questions, but if we just go through slide 19, I wanted to say at the outset that over these 5 years that I've been at CalPERS, we've developed a lot of relationships with the asset classes that are, and I wanted to commend my asset class colleagues for doing a lot of work that I fear we may not be, we will go into depth on each of these icons as to what each asset class is doing, but there's a lot of depth of activity and work that underlines these icons. So I just wanted to congratulate my colleagues for all of the work that they're putting into considering climate change as part of their investment approach. So we collected practices deployed by each asset class in prepping for this discussion. And that's what these icons represent, is bodies of activity that each asset class is undertaking. I will first start with the Sustainable Investment Practice Guidelines, which, apologies for the typo here, it should be practice, not program guidelines. Each asset class developed these guidelines to have a nuanced approach to ESG integration in their investment decision-making process. And so for an example, within our real assets team, the managers in that team engage our external managers to solicit responses to questions around climate risk and other ESG factors, and leverage those responses in their overall score and evaluation of prospective managers and mandates. And the links to these guidelines are in the appendix. They're also being updated as practices evolve. Then going back to the top of this list and going through this more alphabetically, within benchmarking, we looked earlier on slide 5, but I'd like to stay on this slide for now, at the 4 TCFD sectors, agriculture, energy, materials, transportation, and looking at global fixed income as an example, our energy sector so the global fixed income team was looking at reducing active risk relative to its benchmark. And where that reduction was found is in our historic energy exposure. So there, the global fixed income team reduced our exposure about 5% lower than it was 4 years ago. And this was led by a reduction in utilities exposed to coal, again, to come into line with the benchmark in that asset class. Within company research, we looked at global equities' approach to engaging companies in the Climate Action 100 Plus discussion. And to engage effectively, that team has to conduct fundamental analysis on each target company. I'd also like to flag that we have an RFI coming out in the next few weeks where we're soliciting research to improve our own due diligence, looking at climate factors and financial performance and the latest review of evidence from academic researchers and other practitioners on that subject. Going then to manager research, again, our sustainable investment practice guidelines frame how each asset class considers manager performance on ESG. Using private equity this time as an example, we consider our managers' capabilities to consider climate change as part of our due diligence, and the CalPERS team has been interacting with the Institutional Limited Partners Association, or ILPA, to help them develop the ESG due diligence questionnaire over several years, which has now become one of the industry standards in evaluating PE managers' ESG performance. And as examples of PE managers that are thinking about ESG, we saw recent announcements from Blackstone that they've set a goal of reducing carbon emissions by 15% across all new investments within the first 3 years of ownership. We've also seen Tower Brook and Carlyle highlight examples of climate-aligned investment in their reporting. So then just the last two icons here, and then I think we can turn to Q&A. In selection, there's a couple more slides here, but for the sake of brevity, I'll just say climate change research factors into security selection as well, not just manager selection. As an example, in global fixed income, the team is accessing different forms of transition-related risk research and physical climate change-related research as part of their bottoms-up research and relative valuation analysis. Finally, on tools, we have a newly created group within the research and strategy group called Sustain. And that team is vetting the latest ESG tools that come out from the market to see which ones may enhance our investment process, and that team is working internally to sort of consult to the asset classes to help them improve their consideration of ESG data as tools are relevant. One key tool that CalPERS has actually played a hand in developing is a physical climate risk tool that looks at the zip code level. So at a pretty micro level, looking at physical climate risk factors, whether it's extreme heat, water stress, hurricanes, etc. And that was developed by Wellington Management and Woodwell Research Center with input from CalPERS on how to make it useful to our investment teams. So I tried to go through that relatively quickly, but we have people on hand for questions, including Anne and myself, and we're happy to go into detail on any of the above.
Thank you very much, Divya. I did just want to call out the people who were on hand so the board knows this really was a total fund effort. So Nelson de Consecao from our research and strategy group, Rena Lessing from Real Assets, Paul Kramer from Global Fixed Income, Mahbub Hussain from Private Equity, And who am I missing? Samiso Nzima, Samiso's team, who's done such wonderful work on the engagement side. So thank you very much, Divya, for that. I realize there's a lot in the slides, but as Divya said, we would be delighted to answer any questions, and I'm very grateful that our asset class colleagues are here with us as well, if there's something specific to an asset class that you'd like to ask. So thank you, Vice Chair Miller.
Thank you and the whole team for a very encouraging and enlightening presentation. And we have some questions queued up. And I'll start with Director Middleton.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. And I'm really pleased that the prior agenda item and this agenda item were back to back, because I think they very much go together. So my first question, when we think back to divestment decisions, we take out, and this is the question, we're restricting ourselves from an entire class of investments, as I understand it. So my question, and I'll strike this with Dan, do we invest evenly across the board in an entire sector of investments? Or do we selectively choose what is the most appropriate investment within a broad sector?
Thank you for the question, Ms. Middleton. And I think you're asking about the public equity asset class. So correct me if that's not the case, but let me answer. So the way that our cap-weighted benchmark is constructed is all about basically taking the entirety of the equity market. So it's everything that's traded in the equity markets, and then going down to a certain level of capitalization. Right now we go down to 98%. So we take 98% of every country, every sector within that country, every company within that sector, and it goes all the way down to 98%, and then puts that together in a weighting methodology that basically says the size of the portfolio that is publicly traded, the size of the company that's publicly traded, aggregates all of those and puts it together as one overall benchmark. So that's the way a cap-weighted benchmark is constructed. And so that's the first sleeve. The second sleeve, as we know, is factor-weighted, and there is some proprietary modeling there. There's a lot more, mathematics used, but again, it's a quantitative construct to basically consider the entire universe and then try to come up with what we believe to be the an optimal way to weight that from a factor standpoint. But in both cases, all sectors are included, all countries, all sectors.
All right. We have heard in public comment many times that the energy sector has underperformed the market as a whole, and that from a strictly an investment standpoint, if we were to exit the energy sector, we would be gaining in income. Do you believe that is true?
That's a really challenging question, Ms. Middleton, and frankly, I wish I had a crystal ball to answer that question. Really, I will say that one of the theoretical underpinnings of cap weighting is that markets are fairly efficient, specifically equity markets, right? And so the price reflects all known and knowable information that's in the market. So the only way to actually beat that is with, material non-public information, which of course is illegal. So it's really hard for me to say what the oil industry or all of the fossil fuel industry is going to do for the future. I do think that having a cap-weighted portfolio that is 97% indexed is our way of saying that we generally don't think that we can beat the market and that we have a better handle on prices. And yes, while backward-looking, oil companies have underperformed. Every prospectus for every mutual fund you'll ever see will tell you that past performance is not indicative of future returns, and we would tend to subscribe to that.
Could I add a thought to what Dan just said? And it's really that with with an indexed strategy, we're finding the cheapest, if you like, cheapest and most efficient way to harvest returns from the economy. That's how I would explain an indexing strategy. When you're doing stock picking, you're looking at individual securities, and there are certain asset classes like our global fixed income portfolio is based on that approach. But when you're as big as we are, indexing, the history shows if you're as big as we are, it's impossible really over time to beat that market. But here's the thing, even if we had a crystal ball and we could beat the market, we could stock pick or sectors to pick, we're running another risk still, which is those companies which are producing the emissions are still out there doing that in the real economy. And that's causing the global warming, and that's causing the temperature rise, the wildfires, and the sea level rising. So we've got two things in mind here, which is that all of that affects all of our holdings. That, the tool that Divya mentioned, which actually maps our exposure to physical risk, we call it for short the zip code risk tool that we've built. To reduce the risk, we've actually got to bring the emissions down. So having this active ownership approach really does help us tackle that risk. The other thing is we want to see these companies transition. These companies are extremely important right now, to the whole value chain of the industry, the energy that the rest of industry relies on. We were talking the other day about the example of Vestra, this wonderful company that produces windmills, for producing renewable energy. But guess what? It's made from steel, which requires metallurgical coal. There hasn't been a swap out, a substitute for that yet. Requires cement. So we're engaging cement companies and steel companies. And then that windmill has got to be put on a ship and delivered to the place out in the sea where it's going to be set up to produce the renewable energy. So you'll see on the Climate Action 100 list of companies that have made that commitment. The biggest shipping company, Muller-Maersk, the fourth biggest cement company, one of the biggest steel makers, ThyssenKrupp. So we've really, as Divya was saying, we've got to look at the economy in a holistic way. And I think actually that does reflect the investment strategy that we have for this asset class, which is to use an index to harvest the market.
Thank you. And as someone from Palm Springs, I'm always happy to be talking about windmills.
Yes.
We have within our city limits some of the best land in the world for the production of wind energy. I applaud the work that you are doing and applaud staff. Engagement is, I believe, the appropriate strategy moving forward. And in comparison to divestment, it is absolutely the appropriate strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Middleton.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have Director Rubalcava.
Thank you, Vice Chair Miller. Thank you for the presentation. It's very enlightening, and I'm glad to see that CalPERS and you folks in particular are taking the lead in building coalition and doing the advocacy and the work. We always hear a lot. On the one hand, it's good to see these reports coming out with talk about the risk factors and how they impact the economy. So that's easier for people to understand. But the other side, and I think you mentioned in your opening memo, is the whole thing about we're also about long-term value creation. So I was wondering if you could speak to how that element is being factored into your work, and something that Ms. Milton has all the whole thing about the energy transition. How is that working, and what role is CalPERS playing in that arena? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to call on Rena Lessing from Real Assets, if she'd be so kind to join Divya and me for this, because what I think was a very compelling piece of information in our first major report on our climate strategy really showed this extraordinary 18%, that 18% of our private assets by value, and it's gone up since then, really can talk about that, I think it would be helpful to hear from Rena as to how, as one asset class, how real assets is finding this sustainability thinking as a way to evaluate opportunities. So Rena, would you be able to join us? You could just.
Jared, can we please bring Rena Lessing forward to the presenter room, please?
Thanks, Dan.
Okay, I don't know.
Wonderful. Hello.
Hello. Well, thank you for the question. I'm Rena Lessing in Real Assets. Work collaboratively with Anne's group and the Research and Strategy group on sustainability. So on opportunities, I think a good example of that is our energy optimization initiative for real estate. We actually formalized this initiative July 1 of 2019, but had been working several years to kind of pilot aspects of this initiative. And our goal there is to enable the systematic identification, implementation, and tracking of energy-related opportunities. It's also to reduce carbon intensity, helping mitigate the systemic risk of climate change to the real estate portfolio, and more broadly to CalPERS total fund, while enhancing returns and the long-term value of CalPERS investments, primarily through capturing energy cost savings and improving the attractiveness of our assets to tenants. Lastly, another objective is to facilitate transitioning the CalPERS portfolio toward carbon neutrality where it's accretive to performance. And Anne mentioned, I believe, the percentage we have invested in sustainably certified buildings. We had, at the time of the TCFD reporting, I think we had just over $12 billion invested in sustainably certified buildings. We've actually grown that number, and I think as of June, we're just over $15 billion. While it's not a requirement to invest in sustainably certified buildings, where managers do so, it's because it's competitive in the marketplace, and we're doing it to achieve really our targeted returns. We get a number of projects through our annual investment planning process that managers propose that are kind of innovative projects that look at reducing carbon intensity and to achieve those energy savings to improve performance of the assets. And so we really consider this a good opportunity and one that we have seen over the last few years, and then very recently, since we formalized it, produced over 220 projects at least that we're now tracking for improving, making these improvements in the portfolio. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Looking forward to hearing more about those 220 projects. Thank you.
Thank you. And next we have Ms. Paquin.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the report. It's always very impressive, all of the initiatives and work that the team is doing. So we appreciate that. I had a question about, now that we have the Biden administration coming online in January, is there an opportunity to reverse what the SEC has done with regards to proxy access and restrictions on proxy advisors? Also curious about Department of Labor, if they'll be able to reverse their ruling for private plans as well too.
No, thank you for the question. Certainly some of the moves at the SEC, CalPERS has not supported, because our view of capitalism is that you have to give shareholders the information and the rights to protect themselves, and that's the most effective way to go about investor protection. So we were somewhat dismayed to see some of the recent moves. I think in terms of the new administration, we'll have to wait and see who the new chair of the SEC will be and hear what their agenda is. But certainly on some of the recent reforms, not just CalPERS, but the Council of Institutional Investors, where Samisa Enzima sits on the board for CalPERS, has been a very vocal advocate saying, markets need information and investors need rights. And if you take those as your two guidelines on regulatory reform, certainly that's something that enables us to do a better job protecting the interests of our members.
Well, thank you. Hopefully there's an opportunity to change that. I know that's very distressing. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you. And next we have Director Olivares.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. I wanted to know about our plan to meet the governor's executive order on climate change.
Thank you. Let me turn to Divya for that. She worked with Michael Cohen on the CalPERS team to give our feedback into the executive order. And as Divya said, it's something that we welcome. So Divya, would you kindly come back to give a little more insight into the executive order from the governor of California? Thank you.
Sure. So like I said, we're happy to work with the governor's office on reviewing CalPERS strategy on climate change, the UC funds, and CalSTRS. And what we found was a nice surprise in that there was a lot of alignment within and across our funds. And so working with the governor's office, we will be continuing to invest in those activities around engagement, advocacy, and integration, as well as, increasing, I would say, the dialogue between the funds to see where we can go further through collaboration, whereas until now we have had, periodic discussions, but largely those strategies were developed by each fund individually. So I think it's still a bit early to know exactly, any new activities that we would undertake because of the investment framework. At the moment, it's really learning from each other to understand what works along those three pillars.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any more questions. I do have a quick comment as someone who's been employed as a professional scientist, as a professional regulator for the better part of actually over 3 decades now since the Duke Majan administration. It's really exciting to see partnership and working relationships with the governor's office, with regulatory agencies. We really have never had any traction for that in my experience being in California. And it's really encouraging because beyond just the usual easy to access information about corporations and their relationship to the environment and their workforce, there's a lot of inside information. For regulators, and especially the field level people, they know that within a given sector, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly. And they know who they are, and they know how to get to the information that's not always obvious to, for example, investment professionals or others. A perfect example is what's going on with Exide in Southern California right now, where we've sunk $2 billion into trying to deal with the legacy of the aftermath of the pollution and the impacts on the communities, and it's just beginning, and how they're bankrupt. So there's more than just standard greenhouse gas emissions. There's a lot of other information that these kind of partnerships can eventually get us to help us make those smarter investment decisions in the long run that will benefit everybody, including the industries in the long run. So it's very encouraging, very enlightening. Thanks to everyone on the team, and just keep up the great work.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of the programs and asset classes, and to Divya.
And so, seeing no more questions, we do have a couple of public comments on this item, Mr. Fox, I believe.
Yes, Mr. Chair, we have 3 callers on item 8C. The first, Sarah Thies from Fossil Free, California.
Hi, this is Sarah Thies, Fossil Free California and CalPERS retiree. I appreciate the board's continued attention to its responsibilities regarding the risks posed by the unfolding climate disaster. And I personally continue to appreciate the climate risk strategy report and the work since then, especially on integration. The information, data, and analysis are a rich source. I want to pull into my comment a response to Ms. Middleton's question and some of the answers. The report and other material lays out many of the policies and actions CalPERS has taken since at least 2016 with regard to climate risk. I want to comment on an article that appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences earlier this year, which I will send to you all afterwards via the clerk. The researchers looked at what interventions could lead to a sufficiently fast reduction in emissions by mid-century to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade per the Paris Climate Agreement. The interventions were removing fossil fuel subsidies and incentivizing decentralized energy generation, building carbon neutral cities, divesting from fossil fuel linked assets, revealing the moral implications of fossil fuels, strengthening climate education, and disclosing information on emissions. What strikes me is that the CalPERS policies are already supporting many of these items. For instance, especially as to fossil fuel subsidies, it's a great time to work on that given the stated policies of the incoming administration. But what's not in CalPERS' toolbox is the possibility of divestment to avoid the risk of stranded assets. This is very strange to me because as frequently stated in the meetings, I mean, CalPERS is all about, risk and appropriate risk adjusted for returns. I believe it has nothing to do with engagement. All tools are needed, but without considering the possible rapid reallocation of fossil fuel investments, the need to do that, you risk significant and avoidable losses. While it's true that no one can predict the future, there are many reports and articles that indicate that peak oil is coming down this decade. I suggest that the board and staff report on current losses, due in particular to the pandemic and the risk of future losses as the assets continue to decline in value, consistent with your fiduciary duty. And I also urge the board to discuss these concerns with candidates for the CIO position to make sure the CIO is ready for the future and not basing decisions on old thinking or what could happen. The fact that there's tipping points and they could tip pretty fast and CalPERS could be a loser. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Mr. Fox, our next comment.
Yes, Mr. Chair. The next caller is Sandy Emerson, Fossil Free, California.
Members and hello, good afternoon, board members and Vice Chair Miller. My name is Sandy Emerson and I'm the board president of Fossil Free California. First, I want to congratulate Ann Simpson on her confirmation as Managing Investment Director of Board Governance and Sustainability. Well done and well deserved. Second, I want to thank Ann Simpson and CalPERS for collaborating on the recent position paper on thermal coal for the United Nations convened Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance. The 30-member Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, of which CalPERS is a founding member, represents over $5 trillion in assets. The thermal coal position paper calls for the cancellation of all new thermal coal projects, a phase out of all unabated existing coal-fired electricity generation, and a halt to all new financing, development, and planning of further thermal coal power plants. In a move that rightly leverages the power of large investors, the introductory note to the position paper states that divestment is an option for companies that don't clearly demonstrate plans to transition their business to align with a pathway to 1.5 degrees. And I quote, Alliance members will primarily aim to support companies to adopt transition plans through engagement. Members are able to employ an escalation strategy that may over time result in divestment if the company remains irresponsive to its demands. In our view, it would be consistent with the position of the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance if CalPERS sold off its remaining holdings in the thermal coal companies Exxaro, Banpu, and Adaro. These companies were identified for divestment in 2017 in response to SB 185, and they have shown no real progress in transitioning their business activities. CalPERS' increased investment in Exxaro is particularly concerning since Exxaro has a plan for a six-fold expansion of its distribution capability and is a prime supplier for coal-fired electricity generation in South Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And our next comment, Mr. Fox.
Mr. Chair, the last caller is Ferris Kawar, Fossil Free, California.
Good evening. I am a CalPERS member for the last 9 years. In your meeting on December 16th, 2019, Ann Simpson mentioned a report issued by the Principles for Responsible Investing, PRI, titled Inevitable Policy Response, which essentially examines scenarios where abrupt policy shifts lead to stranded assets. The PRI website describes the inevitable policy response as government action to tackle climate change has so far been highly insufficient to achieve the commitments made under the Paris Agreement, and the market's default assumption appears to be that no further climate-related policies are coming in the near term. Yet, as the realities of climate change become increasingly apparent, it is inevitable that governments will be forced to act more decisively than they have so far. The question for investors now is not if governments will act, but when they will do so, what policies they will use, and where the impact will be felt. The IPR project forecasts a response by 2025 that will be forceful, abrupt, and disorderly because of the delay. So my question is, given the following factors, that first of all, science tells us we have 9 years to transition off of fossil fuels. Secondly, the newly elected Democratic White House has called for swift action on climate change. And finally, the growing number of announcements ditching fossil fuels by governments and investors globally is accumulating daily. This includes Governor Newsom's recently announced ban on gas-powered cars by 2035 and an end to fracking. So given those factors, has CalPERS analyzed a scenario where policy shifts happen so rapidly that fossil fuel stock prices plummet due to their stranded assets until these companies are able to transition to a clean energy technologies? And if so, how long do you calculate it will take the oil, gas, and coal industries to make the transition given the current pace of investments in renewable energy? Now remember that the clock is ticking down from 9 years. And do you have reason to believe that the fossil fuel industry will be able to transition to meeting policies faster than the established clean energy competitors who already have proven their ability to meet demand? And finally, how will the losses in value from the stranded assets impact the ability of fossil fuel companies to pivot and remain competitive? Hopefully, we will have a new administration in late January. We know it takes a long time and effort to uncouple fossil fuel holdings from other funds. I believe it's prudent to consider moving from engagement to a strategy of reinvesting that money to hedge against what many experts anticipate as a downward spiral for the industry. And let me be clear, I am not asking for divestment for political or moral reasons. The only reasons you need are economic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Does that conclude our commenters on this item, Mr. Fox?
Yes, Mr. Chair, that concludes comments on item 8C.
Okay, thank you. So we will move to item 8B, Responsible Contractor Policy Program Annual Report.
All right, thank you, Mr. Miller. Jared, if we could please bring James Andrus forward into, I see it looks like he's coming online now. And if we can move Rena Lessing and Divya Mankar back to the attendee room, please. With that, Anne, I'll turn it over to you to introduce 8D.
Thank you very much. Before I go any further, I just want to let everybody know that actually all I have is a head cold. I just had a nice text saying, "Are you okay?" So I want you all to know that I'm not suffering from anything worse with the virus. First of all, it's my pleasure to introduce James Andrus. James this year has been responsible for our responsible contractor policy, which goes back many, many years, back to the 1990s. And also to say a fond farewell to Carrie Douglas Fong, who for some years was running that program. She's just retired. So our good wishes to her. I want just to remind the board that the investment belief that I referenced earlier on climate change is really the one that encapsulates the relevance of this program, which is human capital management. CalPERS has a range of different work on human capital management, but certainly one of the most long-standing and I think well-respected programs is that which speaks to our ambition to be responsible contractors. So with that, let me hand over to James to take us through this year's report. And then we'd be glad to answer any questions that you might have. So James, over to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, James Andrus, Investment Manager, Board Governance and Sustainability. The Responsible Contractor Program policy is operating well. Today, we will provide you with information on the RCP policy covering an overview, history, summary results, and compliance in total contracting. Next slide, please. The RCP policy applies to domestic real estate and infrastructure assets where CalPERS holds greater than 50% interest on contracts equal to or greater than $100,000. Next slide. As Ann pointed out, the first mention of the RCP policy was in 1992. It was carefully crafted by CalPERS external investment managers, labor, fiduciary counsel, pension consulting associates, and staff. The goal of the policy is to hire responsible contractors based on local market conditions while maintaining a competitive bidding process. In 1996, the CalPERS Investment Committee approved and established the program. The policy was most recently amended in 2015 after months of deliberations. The policy is important in the marketplace. It has been replicated by other public pension funds and investors. It sets a standard for responsible contracting. The RCP policy results in positive outcomes for CalPERS, labor stakeholders, and CalPERS investments. Next slide. Next slide, please. All managers provided a report, each with the certification of their contractors and subcontractors that also complied with the policy. Certified responsible contractors received over $840 million last fiscal year and nearly $5 billion over the last 5 years under the policy. Next slide, please. For the fiscal year ending June 30th, 2020, managers reported 100% compliance. The policy continues to serve us well, improving communication with managers and stakeholders while having a baseline we can all rely on. And now I'm open for questions.
Thanks very much, James. I'm not sure if your video is working, but don't be shy.
Okay.
If you're able to come on camera, it would be nice to see you.
Okay.
Yes, Vice Chair Miller, any questions for James?
Let me see. I have a question, it looks like, from Director Rubalcaba.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. I appreciate the report, and thank you again, like I said in the previous report, and I really appreciate you guys taking the lead, CalPERS taking the lead in this area of work. I think the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, has reinforced how important it is that workers provide for, that there be a focus on human capital, that need to keep people safe, but also it's workers and the security officers that make sure that the buildings are clean and all, and so people can come back in, or when they're essential workers, they can still continue to work in some other buildings. So my question is, I know there has a long history you laid out of the responsible contractor policy, and I know it's traditionally has focused on salary and lawful following the law and stuff. Has there been any thought of, or I mean, the pandemic, has it forced us to look at it a different way about how to make sure there's a health and safety protocols are followed, and any of the, what elements have come into the new thinking of RCP policy because of all the experiences we had with the coronavirus, and especially in real estate?
Thank you very much for the question. And in this particular instance, the RCP policy has performed remarkably well. It's not just a policy, basically, it's a system of communicating with the managers and with the stakeholders. And so when you look at a particular area and how it performed during the pandemic, the RCP managers did a very good job in communicating with the employees, communicating with the stakeholders, the unions, and communicating with us. And so they are, in fact, under dramatic pressure, but they did a wonderful job with communicating with their employees, and in our opinion, doing a good job in taking care of those employees under the circumstances. And so when you look for issues, I think it's amazing to find that because of the strategic planning that took place in setting up the policy, that is actually performed probably better than one would have expected. So this is actually an area of strength. And so the concern you have, I think, would be more of a concern when operating outside of the policy. But inside the policy, I think we have in fact seen strength in how it operated.
Thank you for that answer, and I'm very comforted by it. I remember at some other meeting, Investment Chair Taylor mentioned that she had heard that there would have been, I believe it was hundreds of workers working buildings that have passed away because of coronavirus, but I guess in our experience it's been working. So I appreciate your work and the answer. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. David. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any more comments or questions from the board, but I understand we do have a public commenter on this item 8D. Mr. Fox?
Yes, Mr. Chair, we have Mr. Michael Ring with SEIU.
Hi, Investment Committee, Vice Chair Miller, thank you all for the opportunity to speak today. To you, this is Michael Ring with the Service Employees International Union. As you know, SEIU has over 200,000 members who participate in CalPERS, and nearly 2 million members who work in essential industries across the United States, Canada, and Puerto Rico. Our members are public employees, healthcare workers, long-term care workers, daycare workers, security officers, airport service workers, and commercial office cleaners. In other words, our members are essential workers. These workers have always been vital to the functioning of our society and economy. Without them, those in need of care go uncared for. Without them, many of the rest of us cannot go to work because we are worried about a loved one needing care, or we cannot do the work we need to do in the office because the conditions aren't there to facilitate our work. And during this pandemic, the fundamental role these workers play has only become more clear, as they are asked to risk their lives so that society continues to function. Tragically, many have lost their lives over the last 7 months going to work. and this lack of care in protecting their lives is not acceptable on an ethical level, nor as an investment risk strategy. However, as Mr. Andrus pointed out in response to Mr. Rubalcapo's question, the RCP has been critical in protecting not only workers' lives, but also your investments. As fiduciaries, you are responsible for ensuring you invest the retirement savings of CalPERS members in a manner that, through prudence and diligence, provides the best risk-adjusted return on these investments. Today, it is clear that in order for fiduciaries to meet their investment goals, they and their staff and consultant and investment partners must understand and value the fundamental role essential workers play in our economy. Companies across your portfolio in public equity, fixed income, and private asset classes are realizing that without these essential workers, public and private, they cannot successfully carry out their business plans. There will be no healthy economy in which to invest for the long term if we don't value the people who make economic activity possible. In that context, I want to thank CalPERS board and staff for the presentation on responsible contracting, and more importantly, for CalPERS leadership and understanding many years before others did that CalPERS' success in real estate investing is directly connected to responsible contracting in the real estate industry. The long track record of success for all stakeholders through this program and the benefit it has brought to CalPERS participants is clear. Our members thank you all for your fiduciary leadership. We also ask you to build off the success of the RCP and use it as a model to continue your efforts to figure out how to apply the same value to workforce risk management in each of the other asset classes in your portfolio, as you do in real assets through the RCP. You had an excellent discussion of these issues with key ideas brought forward in this regard at your most recent offsite. SEIU supports the efforts of this committee, your staff, and your investment partners to continue to lead in the integration of strategies that value the contributions of workers to their companies, our economy, and to investors. It is one of the most fundamental investment approaches you can apply to ensure retirement benefits are there for CalPERS beneficiaries for generations to come. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Is that the last of our commenters, Mr. Fox?
Yes, Mr. Chair, that concludes public comment. We'll have one more on item 11.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much for the presentation. Again, encouraging, and really appreciate the great work of the team on this. So we'll move on to item 9, action item independent oversight. I believe this one will ultimately come to Mr. Jacobs.
Yes, it does. So good evening, board members. Matthew Jacobs, General Counsel. This item concerns a pending transaction in which the board's primary general pension investment consultant, Wilshire Associates, is being purchased by 2 private equity firms, Motive Partners and CC Capital, in addition to other confidential investors. A third private equity firm, Ares, will be a secured lender on the deal. The question for the board is whether to consent to Wilshire's assignment of your contract for advisory services to the new entity. So the agenda item itself lays out the chronology of Wilshire's advising CalPERS of the transaction, which I note has not closed yet. It is scheduled to close next month. And CalPERS's response or seeking and obtaining more information about the transaction and Wilshire's approach to handling potential conflicts. Wilshire provided additional information that had not been attached to the agenda item last week, and those have been uploaded to Diligent. The issue in a nutshell is that once the transaction closes, Wilshire will be owned by 2 private equity firms and other confidential investors. This raises potential conflicts and appearance issues that the board should consider in deciding whether to consent to the requested assignment. Wilshire is here to answer any questions you may have, and I would note that our fiduciary counsel, Ashley Dunning, is standing by as well. So with that, I I will turn it back to you as the vice chair to field or to handle questions from your colleagues to Wilshire or to me or to Ms. Dunning.
Okay. I guess I will start off myself with just from my perspective, I have always found Wilshire, I've never lacked confidence in the advice they were giving us or in the people giving us the advice. And to me, this is not about that so much as, boy, the timing of this is very challenging, and the potential for perceptions of impropriety or perceptions of conflict of interest or just so much is very challenging right now. And it puts us in a position, in a way, of we're the one having to sell this to stakeholders if we go down this same path. So that's where my concerns lie. Start the conversation off. So let's see who's in the queue first. It's a long queue. Okay. Looks like President Jones is the first question in the queue.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Yeah, I guess one question is to Matt, and then the second question is to Wilshire. But I agree with Vice Chair Miller comments about the service over the years have been, I thought, very good. In fact, in a lot of cases, excellent. So it's not about the service that's being provided. And also to Chair Miller's comment that the timing couldn't be worse. You know, we got an asset liability management coming up on us. We got the review of the divestments coming up on us, et cetera. So a lot of key issues, and also looking at the capital markets assumptions in this very, very volatile market that we've been experiencing. And so the continuity becomes important. So having said all of that, my question to Mr. Jacobs is that, can we cancel this anytime? In other words, if we were to go forward and if we believe that some of the issues that can be addressed and subsequent to that, sometime in the future, can we cancel at any time?
Yes, we can. I believe there's a 10-day notice provision in the contract.
Okay.
It's certainly no more than 30 days, but it's, I believe it's 10.
Okay.
For no cause. Cause or no cause.
Cause or no cause. Okay, so it's like immediate then. If something happens that is not in our best interest going forward. So my question to Wilshire is that in the material that you forwarded to us, you talked about an independent conflict of interest party. Could you describe to us how that would work? They're being independent, would they be providing updates to our board in addition to your board, et cetera?
Mr. Jones and members of the board, we're happy to touch on that. And first, let me just say we truly appreciate the opportunity to update the board on this organizational change, as it's a very exciting time. Before we get to that question, Henry, if I can just introduce my colleagues. With me today is our Chief Operating Officer, Ben Bowie. Chief Operating Officer, Jason Schwartz, and Chief Compliance Officer, Ben Bowie, and Steve Foresti, who, of course, you all know. I'm actually going to turn it over to Ben to talk about the third-party independent compliance consultant, and he can talk about all of the specifics that that go along with that. Ben, do you want to take it away?
Absolutely. Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to answer your questions. So the third-party body is intended to be both an assistance in us helping to derive appropriate policies and procedures. We take great comfort in the strength of our policies and procedures, but it's really in addition to that, just to provide additional comfort to our clients and internally to our board. Secondarily, what they would be there for is a big part of our compliance program is not just implementing these policies and procedures, but having oversight, making sure that we're going back and making that everybody is actually implementing the policies and procedures as they should be.
Excuse me, Tom, he's kind of breaking up and I'm having, at least I don't know if it's just me, but I'm having problems hearing him clearly. Could you?
So I'm hearing him okay. How about, can I get a check from anybody else? No, you're not getting him? Okay. So let me provide the information I can. So the third-party compliance consultant is meant to be really a belt and suspenders approach. We're very confident that the compliance framework that we've had in place for our full 35-year relationship with you is robust and can handle both the perception as well as actual conflicts and manage them appropriately. The third-party consultant is really meant to come in and make sure that the policies that we have in place are being implemented and followed. And so that's the, if you want to call it an audit or something along those lines, the role that that third party could play, which is really meant to provide you, the CalPERS board, with the ability to get comfortable that our compliance framework is incredibly strong and that there is no chance that the perception of conflict will turn into an actual conflict that will impact CalPERS.
And so my question, so do we have unfettered access to that compliance group?
Well, can you hear me or not? If not, I'll turn off my video. It might be helpful.
Okay, you might try that.
Okay, let me try turning off the video and seeing if that improves the audio quality. Is that better?
A little bit.
A fidelity thing, like you don't have a microphone.
It seems that I don't have a microphone.
Respectfully.
Yeah, no, let me, I'm trying to find other means. Let's see here. Is that improving it at all?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. So let me say that it's what you would have access to are any reports produced by the third-party consultant, as well as they will be reporting to us generally, and then certainly. I can't answer, I mean, typically, no. Typically, we are engaging with them like we would with our accountants or as we would with those who come in to provide audits to us, and then providing those reports to the board.
Okay. Okay, that's all I have right now.
Mr. Chair, would it be helpful if we walk through the presentation which we provided within the materials?
Yeah, I think that might be helpful. I don't know if everyone's really had a chance to really digest that material, but if we could just hit the high points.
Of course, I didn't mean to suggest all of those materials. I know there's a lot there, but the organizational update slide deck. By the time we wrap up with this discussion, I think you'll have a clear understanding that, number one, this transaction will improve our ability to provide CalPERS with the best advice possible. Number two, there are no direct conflicts here because we do not provide manager recommendations for CalPERS. And number three, our compliance program effectively identifies and manages conflicts. So as Steve will discuss, there's no legitimate risk that the perception of conflict materializes to impact CalPERS. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Jason to provide more detail on our path going forward. I'm going to flip to slide 2.
Terrific. Good evening, members of the board. I know it's been a long day, and likewise, like Tom, I want to thank you for the opportunity to address you all. As many of you know, Wilshire was founded almost 50 years ago by Dennis Tito. And Dennis has remained our chairman and CEO since that time. And Dennis has also always owned a majority of the firm. The investment here by Market Partners and CC Capital, really at its core, will allow Wilshire to pass the mantle of leadership to the next generation of leaders, ensuring the continuity and stability of our investment platform and culture, and ensuring we can continue to help investors improve their outcomes for decades to come. We will also be able to make meaningful investments in tools and technology and people, really the foundational elements of a world-class investment consulting business. We can do that now more than ever. It also solidifies Wilshire's presence as a growing, hiring California-based company. If we kindly move to the next slide. From an operating perspective, I want to note that there's really little change in the governance structure and the individuals responsible for the day-to-day management of Wilshire. CalPERS will continue to be supported by the same team and process, which will only be enhanced through greater investment over time and capabilities. These new partners, the growth equity partners, will not participate in any investment-related discussions concerning our clients, nor will they have access to any client-specific information. Our investment process will remain insulated from any outside influence. We're certainly aware of concerns about potential conflicts of interest, whether real or perceived. We've long had in place, as Ben noted, and we can talk more about it, we've long had in place a very comprehensive compliance framework. It's worked really well for the duration of our 35-year relationship. And we know, of course, that managing conflicts is incredibly important to CalPERS. You've noted some of the timing issues. It's important for all of our clients. It's important for Wilshire as well. Our compliance team is staffed by dedicated professionals who have decades of experience, supported by outside experts, lawyers, other specialists, to ensure that we're always following best practices in conflict identification and control. And so I'd like to actually turn it back to Ben, who heads that compliance function, who has a couple slides on our process in more detail, which I think will create additional levels of comfort. Ben?
Thank you, Jason. Let me begin by saying on slide 4, what we seek to lay out there is what's the basis of all that we do. The very foundation is how seriously we take our fiduciary obligation to you and to all of our clients. And so all of our actions are intended to make sure that they are in the best interest of the work we are doing for you. And what I want to show the board is how Wilshire implements the excellent controls that we've put in place. But more than that, I want to point out that actually some of the greatest security you should take is, as someone stated earlier, is in the ethics of the men and women who are privileged to serve CalPERS and all of their constituents. But added to that is the extensive infrastructure that we have put in place for recognizing and dealing with conflicts of interest, which have really been honed over the 50 years that we've been doing business. And in fact, so much so, we raise a skeptical eye to any financial firm that claims, quote unquote, be conflict-free. From Wilshire's standpoint, and as the market understands, conflicts can arise unintentionally and sometimes for good reason. And we recognize that what is important is how we manage those potential conflicts and ensure that the advice we provide to our clients is independent of the influences that may arise because of conflict. And so as we discuss on slide 5, we do this by 3 primary things: controls, oversight, and transparency. If we can move to slide 5. Controls include our well-defined process for research and investment, and barriers that we create to make sure we segregate information that may create conflict. We do this by having ongoing oversight of these controls, as we mentioned, and that's where the belt and suspenders comes in with the third party. And lastly, we do this through transparency to our client regarding our conflicts, as we've done in this case, and how we manage those conflicts. With this in mind, we've evaluated the conflicts that might arise in relation to Wilshire's sale to private equity firms. And the conclusion we've ultimately come to is that with regards to CalPERS, the conflicts are manageable because of our service mandate. Our service mandate does not include evaluating or recommending investment managers, including private equity firms. And so in other words, to paraphrase the Political Reform Act, Wilshire is in no position to make or in any way attempt to use our official position to influence a governmental decision in which we know or have reason to know we have a financial interest. And so that just simply doesn't come into play. Nonetheless, recognizing that the appearance of a conflict does raise concerns, we've taken additional steps to provide comfort to CalPERS and to our clients. The most important of these is that we have explicitly mandated that our consultants not evaluate, recommend, or directly invest in our new owners. And this eliminates the prospect that our new owners can anyway benefit from any influence Wilshire could assert upon its client. And so before I turn this over to Steve, I just want to point again to all the information that we've provided, which is listed in slide 6, which should give reflects all of our updated policies, our updated ADV, the updated procedures. And we have given you this to give the board the additional comfort that Wilshire will remain confident in its ability to fulfill our fiduciary obligation, just as we have for the past 35 years to CalPERS. Thank you. Steve?
Thank you. Okay, and I think I'll move on to our next question. I think comes from Director Brown.
Thank you. So Steve, I'm sorry, Tom. I would never call the CEO Steve. Okay. Can you tell me how often you are opining, or what kind of opinion you give us when a PE deal comes forward?
So, Member Brown.
Generally, not specifically.
None is the short answer for private equity.
Right, because we get those from another consultant.
From Makita is your private asset consultant.
Great. Right. This is not just for me. This is for people who are on the web as well. Okay. And so you're not giving us any opinions as to whether or not the investment meets the board's requirements or meets the board's delegated authority or anything else like that that's coming through Makita.
For private equity, that's correct.
Okay, great. So I believe one of your I guess they're your shareholders now, he basically said that you're going to keep, the information is going to be separated. So the information would not be shared. So how is that going to occur? Are you going to have standalone systems? We're curious as to how you're going to ensure that that Ares and the other two firms don't have access to that information.
I'll start, and then Ben, if you can get into specifics of information management. I mean, I think at the very beginning, they're not involved in our investment process. So to the extent we're putting together asset class assumptions with the work that Steve Foresti and his team do, they have literally no input into that and provide no influence over it. In terms of specific information management processes, Ben, can you touch on those?
Yeah, our network is divided so that only specific areas of the network are accessible to those who have need of that information. That is maintained by our IT division, and any exceptions to that is required to be approved by me or our general counsel. And so it's part of our data management process internally.
And so that's how you're going to keep that information segregated?
That's correct. And so we segregate those divisions, those set parts of the network.
So Tom, can you tell me, can you explain for me just a recent conflict you may have had and how your policies helped resolve that?
Recent conflict that I have had.
As a board member,
yeah.
I'm always concerned that my staff is going to be pushing you to adopt a new policy or a modified policy or a delegation of authority that maybe, you don't necessarily agree with. And those are the conflicts I'm worried about. But what kind of conflict else could come up?
So the most specific conflict here is the recommendation of the private equity partners for investment. Either in an indirect way or a roundabout way, I should say. That's the most direct conflict that can show up in this case, and it does not exist. Because we don't provide we don't work in that mandate for you, but also, as Ben alluded to, we've specifically set in place procedures to avoid that exact conflict. So we just took it off the table.
Okay, and then, and this question is for our legal counsel. And so, Matt, you know, I always like to delve into being a pretend lawyer. So how about we get like a financial hold harmless from them for violating any conflicts of interest?
Well, it's an interesting idea. I don't think they'd sign it, but the potential liability. I mean, look.
Oh, you're frozen, Matt.
I'm frozen because I don't know how to answer that question.
So the way we do it is we, in construction, right? We get hold harmlesses, right? We bond around a problem or something like that. So
let me suggest this. I mean,
here's my concern. Here's a concern, I should say. It's not so much on a particular transaction because, as Mr. Toth said, they're not going to be representing a company or a GP that we're interested in investing in. I think the bigger concern is perceptual. And here's an example. And I mentioned this to the Wilshire folks a couple of weeks ago. They're going to be opining next year on asset allocation. So what do they do with respect to advice on how much CalPERS should be invested in private equity, given that they have ownership, that they're owned by private equity? And it's an appearance issue. Maybe it's not a real issue, but it's an appearance issue. It's a confidence issue. And that's not really the sort of thing that you can quantify and say, you know, give us $500 million for that. And even if we could, I don't think Wilshire is good for it. Maybe they are.
I appreciate that. You know, my concern, Matt, is that not only are they owned by private equity, but they're shareholders in private equity. So it's not just that they're owners; they all share in those profits. I believe they share in those profits. So, all right, that's all I have. Thank you.
Member Brown and other members of the committee, David, if I could I let Steve walk through an example of what would need to transpire for that perception to become a real conflict? Because we've thought very carefully about this, believe me, because we know how important perception is. And in that discussion, we've got these steps that we've laid out and to illustrate what a candidly stretch that would be. Steve, can I ask you to comment on that?
Yeah. Sure, I'd be happy to. I just want to make sure everybody can hear me and see me. I just had to sign back in because I was having a computer problem. Am I good?
You are.
Terrific. Yeah, so to Tom's point, you know, the way I would look at this, and I think in the most practical way I could lay it out, in order to bridge the gap between the perception or the potential of this conflict that Wilshire would you know, might be artificially biased to promote the private market. So to take that potential and bridge it to the risk that conflict materializes in any real way to impact CalPERS, one has to essentially accept a series of conditions all to be true. And, you know, Tom mentioned, and I'd love to lay those out for you because I think it's a pretty extensive list. But, you know, it begins with the idea that Motive and CC Capital are unethical and would motivate Wilshire to act in a way that would violate its fiduciary obligation. So that's condition number one. Condition number two would be that our new owners believe that by Wilshire artificially promoting the private markets, there's some sort of financial benefit to be gained. Presumably that, you know, if we encourage clients to push some additional capital generally into the private markets, into this $4 trillion private equity space, that a couple of those dollars would come back to CC Capital in Motive. And in my mind, this is akin to me dumping a bucket of water into the ocean and expecting to see its level rise. Number three, our owners would further have to believe that that questionable benefit is worth the considerable business and existential reputational risk that would be required for its pursuit. Number four, all of Wilshire's governance around management structure, compliance control, the reporting and the oversight around those controls, all of that would need to fail in protecting the independence of Wilshire's investment platform. And then finally, Wilshire's investment team, and indeed, Wilshire's CalPERS service team, would all need to knowingly participate in those failures. And the way we look at it, and I would suggest that it's hard to imagine that any one of those conditions could be met, let alone all of them, which again is what would be required for that potential conflict or that perception of a conflict to actually be realized in any real way to impact CalPERS. So for us, it's getting there is a bridge too far, and we believe that's the conclusion that anyone who objectively analyzes the perceived conflict in terms of its potential to become a real issue would conclude as such. So that's kind of the way I think about it, and nobody is denying that there may be a conflict there, at least a perception of it, but to us it really is a bridge too far to get from that perception to the reality of it potentially causing any harm whatsoever or being realized in any way.
Yeah, so we have a number of other questions, and a quick comment is, thanks for that, Steve.
You bet.
That's maybe compelling to me, but I know that a lot of members, a lot of stakeholders are pretty immune to rational, logical arguments sometimes if they've got a preconceived perception or an inclination to think the worst and accept, some pretty wild misinformation, disinformation, conspiracies, and we've seen that play out where we end up having to spend lots of our time and staff time trying to quell what are sometimes some pretty ridiculous notions that get established that's just an additional hurdle and a lot of work for us. And sometimes with some stakeholders, we can never really quell them. So I think, who do I have now? I think it's Director Olivares next.
Thank you, Mr. Miller, and I appreciate the comments from my colleagues, particularly President Jones. I think that was very insightful, the suggestion that we perhaps get more information and maybe defer this. I'd like to direct the board's attention to the supplemental materials provided from Wilshire Associates. There are many, but in those, it is mentioned that there is a potential conflict of interest. I think we've had this great longstanding relationship with Wilshire, but many of us might be concerned that there could be a repeat of Arthur Andersen and Enron here, right? So we don't want a conflict that's going to compromise the integrity of our fund and hurt our members. So within the supplemental materials, I'd like to pull up the updated RFP, page 9, number 22. And just as we're pulling that up, I'd like to say that I understand that whenever we engage in a significant contract, there's usually some type of key person provision, as we discussed earlier in the day with something else. And so I understand that since obviously the ownership has changed, this is an opportunity for us to revisit the terms of the contract. And so I would like board members to keep that in mind. Maybe we're not able to pull that up, but if people could just look at that, that would be great. The other question I had has to do with private debt. So I understand that Ares is lending to Wilshire / Motive, and I want to know how we can provide some type of insulation as it results to recommendations to CalPERS on private debt.
I'll start, Ms. Oliveris, and then I'll turn it over to Ben if you have any more specific comments around that. So first and foremost, we do not bring investment ideas like the potential to invest in Aries to CalPERS. So that's number one. Number two, as it relates specifically to this transaction, Wilshire was not a party to selecting Aries as a lender. And then finally, number three, they're a lender. So you can think about them as a bank. In the same way you are taking out a loan from a Wells Fargo or a Citibank, the insulation from the provider of those funds is pretty absolute. You don't look through Wells Fargo to their depositors who are providing you with the information. So I think there is a reasonably substantial cushion between Wilshire and CalPERS vis-a-vis the Aries lending relationship.
Ben, do you want to? Excuse me, I want to say the way I'd actually like to continue. I would like to see the way I understand these lending contracts to work is that there are provisions that allow the lender in some cases to recall or change the amount lent if their clients change. So for example, if the relationship between Wilshire and CalPERS were not to continue, I'm wondering if that is mentioned anywhere in the agreement with Aries, because there is a clear potential conflict there.
So Ben, maybe this is actually a better question for Jason. In terms of the structure of the deal and with Aries. So Jason, do you want to take that?
Sure. I mean, to be clear, I mean, Aries is not a lender to, we didn't select Aries, Mrs. Oliveris. And I will say that the lending, in the sense that I think what you're getting at, which is an important question, is if the CalPERS relationship was in question, would we not be able to, cover that loan, or would that be a breach of covenant in some respect? And the answer to that is decidedly no. There's no way for that loan to be called by virtue of the fact that something happening with the CalPERS relationship, period, full stop. And so there is no ongoing incentive for us to in any way change or recommend or in any way sort of alter the normal course of advice that we would provide to clients as a fiduciary, given the fact that Aries is a passive lender to the organization.
So the term of the loan does not include any language regarding loss of significant clients? None,
Mrs. Oliveris, are noted specifically. There are no specific references to any particular clients. It's a covenant light loan. The coverage ratio, if you will, is very conservative.
The DSCR, yeah.
Yeah.
But no, I'm not talking about CalPERS specifically, but I'm talking about loss of clients. I would like to move on to the ADV2A, and so thank you for providing the form. I appreciate that. Can we go to page 19? Are we not able to bring that up on screen? Okay, well then I guess should I just talk through it? So on page 19 of the Form ADV2, the conflicts of interest are listed there, and Wilshire recognizes that this transaction does create conflicts of interest. So I just want to be sure that we're all very aware of that. And then in page 20, transparency is addressed, and 21 on controls. There's some language regarding ethical walls. Would you please walk us through that?
Sure. An ethical wall is, as I described earlier, they are the barriers for data and information. So there are two types. There's the electronic ethical walls around our networks that prevent certain professionals from accessing parts of the network that would give them information that would represent a conflict of interest. because we recognize that it is, the theory would be that having certain information may skew the advice they may give to a client. And then, other ethical walls would be the physical sharing of documents that prevent, once again, access to what may end up becoming a conflict. And so it's not meant to address necessarily this specific conflict. Some of those ethical walls are intended to address other conflicts that we recognize within Wilshire.
Thank you. Also in the supplemental materials, there's a section on conflict of interest procedures, which I see is only in draft form. I'd like to know which third party has provided legal review on behalf of CalPERS of this transaction and the documentation provided.
So the one that you are seeing is in draft form because it's being updated. The red lines show you the changes. Anything without the red lines is currently policy. That is our current procedures. And once again, we would never, we couldn't, we would have no one representing CalPERS. I mean, we couldn't hire someone on your behalf. That would be outside of our mandate.
Yes, I'm sorry. It's a question I'm asking. Perhaps our counsel could answer that.
Sure.
Thank you. Mr. Jacobs?
Well, we have reviewed the protocols that have been provided. We're not experts on it, but we've got our views on it. Ms. Dunning has also reviewed it. My biggest issue with them is really that and Wilshire's been talking about their policies have been in place for 35 years, but we've got a new situation here, and so we can look at their policies and they may have been perfectly implemented for the last 35 years, but this is a new situation. We don't know, and these policies are new, and so we don't know really how they're going to work, and we don't have sufficient insight into how things work at Wilshire to know whether these are appropriate. So we could spend a lot of time and a lot of money. I'm just not sure that we will get further than we are today, which is they may look good on paper and they may provide us some comfort, and they may provide the board some comfort, but we don't really know how they're going to work in practice.
I'd love to hear from Ms. Dunning if we can on this.
Yeah, can we bring Ms. Dunning on?
Could you elevate her, David, please?
Good evening. Can you hear me and see me now?
Yes.
We can.
Okay. I would echo Mr. Jacobs' comments that this whole transaction is so new in the sense that there's a completely new ownership structure for Wilshire, new reporting relationships, new financial interests of current Wilshire employees that will exist as a result of the transaction, that to assess how all of that will play out and whether the various controls that have been described to you will be sufficient in the context of the mandate that Wilshire has with you. I think it's a little bit premature to say one way or the other. The big picture fiduciary question for the board, I believe, is what to do in the current context where you have your ALM coming up soon, as you noted, as I think Trustee Jones noted. You have various important processes in which you need to engage with a fiduciary to receive advice. Are you confident that you can continue to do that with Wilshire providing you with sound advice? Do you need to make sure that while you're receiving that advice from Wilshire, you're engaging in an additional, say, parallel effort to ensure that you're receiving reports from the third-party compliance officer whom they've hired? Or does this lead to a loss of confidence that makes you look elsewhere or decide that you need to look elsewhere? And that's really, I think, what you need to be discussing right now. I don't know, it doesn't appear to me to be an absolute prohibition on going forward with Wilshire, the way that they've laid it out. But it's a question of whether you think they can comply with their fiduciary obligations to them in light of to you in light of this new ownership structure. As Matt or Mr. Jacobs said earlier, it's good that you are able to end the relationship in short order if you were to provide the consent, but then decide that it was not, you were not pleased with the way in which the company was proceeding under this new ownership. My question has been whether you can hold off on providing the consent and still retain Wilshire, so that you're not necessarily accepting this transaction, but are continuing with them. I'm not sure if that's actually a possibility, but it's occurred to me. I've been concerned about the same things that a number of you have raised about Ares, about the private equity pension that could potentially come out of this, but you've gotten some good responses from Wilshire on some of those topics as well. So I'd say this is a judgment call that has, where you're asking the right questions, but today should not be a final decision on anything. You could make a decision to proceed with further reporting back to the board, but I would say this is probably the beginning of the conversation rather than the end.
Thank you.
It looks like next we have Ms. Paquin.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I appreciate the conversation that we've been having, and also wanted to say that on behalf of the controller, we've always appreciated the relationship with Wilshire and the advice that they've given us and the work that they've done. But we feel very strongly that this is going to lead to a lot of reputational risk for CalPERS, especially as we embark on the ALM process next year. And as we are trying to do that thorough process and provide assurances to our members and stakeholders that we are looking at every possible allocation options to ensure the success of the fund, it's going to be very distracting to answer questions about Wilshire's ownership, we feel. So again, we remain very, very concerned. We appreciate all of the actions Wilshire has tried to take to assure their clients about conflicts of interest or potential conflicts. But we just feel that at the end of the day, it's going to come down to a lot of reputational risk and headline risk. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Director Rubalcaba.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I had a question for Wilshire. I think Mr. Todd was talking about some sort of third-party compliance consultant, but I didn't actually see it in the slides. But so I had two questions there. One is this a new entity that Wilshire's contracting with, or has a contractual relationship already existed? That's the first question. And second, what is their experience or qualifications that brought Wilshire to select them as their third-party compliance consultant?
Sure, and I can take that. This would be a new relationship that we are establishing to give additional comfort to groups such as CalPERS. Once again, what we primarily rely on at Wilshire is our history, is the strength of our team, is our deep understanding of conflict of interest and how to manage them that we've been doing for a very long time. And so this really, Tom put it best when he said this was a belt and suspenders approach to looking at this. So we have selected ACA compliance group. They are well known in the industry. About 75% of the people who work for ACAA come directly from regulators. They have very direct experience in dealing with compliance programs, not just from the standpoint of implementing them, but overseeing them, examining them, and being able to determine the strength of those programs.
It might be helpful, thank you. It might be helpful for our legal office and the trustees to get a better understanding of what the relationship is going to be, if there's a contractual, see the copy of their scope of work or something in a future presentation. Thank you.
Okay, I had a question for Matt. In terms of sounds like a lot of extra activity, a lot of extra baggage, a lot of extra complications. And so what would the process be? How quickly could we get another firm on board if we needed to, if all the complications don't work out, or the compensation for all those complications or whatever?
Not very quickly, unless it was Makita. Makita serves, it actually has it in its contract that it is a backup general investment consultant for the board. But that is not the same as your primary, so it's not as if we could just rely on Makita without some kind of further negotiation for its enhanced role. But on the presumption that they would be interested in that role, and that we would be able to reach contractual terms for them to fulfill that role, that's just, I guess that's the most expedient way of filling this role, were you to go down that path. And presumably that could be done in a few weeks or maybe even quicker. If we don't do that and you want to do an RFP, I mean, that takes a long time. It takes several months. I think that. Would
that be an interim step to an RFP, or would it be?
You could do that. You could do that, absolutely. Another thing that you could do is to maintain Wilshire while you do an RFP. Now, one thing I would note about Makita stepping into the role as primary is that this board has had a policy of not wishing that its private asset class consultants also be its general pension consultant. And that is based primarily, as best we could recreate, on this concern that you don't want the general kind of looking over the shoulder of its own advice with respect to the private asset classes. So if you move Makita up to position number one, and you wanted to maintain that policy, you would want to get new private asset class consultants.
Okay, next, I have a question from Director Middleton.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. And I thank everyone for the questions and the comments that we've had so far. I want to preface what I have to say that, well, Wilshire's had a 35-year relationship. I've not been on the board for 35 years. And during my time, Wilshire has been essentially my relationship with Mr. Toth and Mr. Foresti. And I have found both of them to be exemplary. I have truly enjoyed their wisdom and their promptness with everything that has come across. So I preface anything I say with I'm completely impressed with both of you and appreciate your work. I want to ask Mr. Binu to describe for us the kinds of consultations and interactions that you and the investment office have with Wilshire. When are they involved in meeting with you, and describe those conversations and relationships?
Well, there's a lot of them. Thank you for the question, Ms. Middleton. Currently, Arnie and I check in with Wilshire monthly. We also check in with Makita monthly, just to kind of provide an update on where we are, with the team, with upcoming investment committee, with upcoming topics, all of those kinds of things. Then also annually, Wilshire does the review of the total fund, right? So they're part of that, the total fund trust level review that we just saw in September. And what happens is that in September, staff takes the lead. In March, the consultants take the lead, including Wilshire, and Wilshire reviews the overall general pension and then also reviews the public asset classes. So that's the other big area they're involved with us. Certainly in the case of the tracking error item that you saw earlier, we definitely wanted to make sure that that we were walking along with Wilshire, and we worked with them to incorporate their thoughts and feedback, understand any concerns that they would have, as far as if we were to consider certain changes to the policy. So there's all of those things. And then the last thing I can think of is that currently Wilshire also opines for opportunistic, just the way that Makita opines for private equity and real assets. They opine that something is consistent with policy and delegation. Currently, Wilshire does that for the Opportunistic Strategies program.
So the perception that would be the common perception of the general public is that because Wilshire is would be owned by a private equity firm, that they would at some point nudge or move an investment decision in the direction of something that would favor their ownership or an investment of their ownership. Is that something that you are concerned about, that you would not be able to detect?
Candidly, in the case of staff, I would not be concerned about that. So I hear all of Matt's concerns, and Matt and Ashley, I'm very sensitive to those concerns. For our staff as investment professionals, I would not have those concerns, just because our team is dealing with conflicts constantly. Every time we trade in the markets in a principal transaction, there's a conflict. Every time we work on lots of places in this business where for-profit firms are interacting with us, there's potential conflict. So our job is to be aware of those conflicts and protect the organization from those. So for us as the investment staff, I wouldn't have those concerns.
So I'll finish with a comment. I really appreciate what Mr. Jacobs and Ms. Dunning had to say. And what I did not hear from either one of them is that they're satisfied that we have a process in place or an understanding in place that removes any doubt. And until we have something that our councils can take and tell us as a board, this is a reliable process moving forward, I think we have to have more conversation. I need to be able to hear from Ms. Dunning and Mr. Jacobs that they are satisfied with this relationship going forward, and I've not heard that. And I don't want to take and, as a board, make a decision without the support of our attorneys. So I would like to see a conversation continue between staff and council at CalPERS and Wilshire to see whether or not we can have a recommendation to continue this relationship that is satisfactory to our council.
Okay, looks like I do not see any more questions.
Vice Chair Miller, could I make a comment here in response to Ms. Middleton's? This is Tom from Wilshire.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Thanks very much. First of all, I'd like to say, Ms. Middleton, thank you for your kind comments. We take great pride in the fiduciary service we provide to you guys, and that's, I think, number one, the protection offered to CalPERS. But more specifically around what we're talking about here, I think it's really important to understand that this consent doesn't lock CalPERS into anything additional. It doesn't change the terms of the contract, and it certainly doesn't reduce your ability to undertake further due diligence. And in fact, we welcome that. And as Mr. Jacobs pointed out, you can terminate us at any time. You have that ability. This consent in front of you doesn't change that at all. So we know that we have to prove ourselves to you day in and day out, because while our contract might say 3 years, it's really month to month with very limited notice. And that's why we can say here today that we're going to do just that. We're going to prove ourselves to you day in and day out, and we're going to get you any information that you need to get comfortable.
Mr. Vice Chairman, just one other data point. This is Jason at Wilshire, and Steve Foresti. I don't know if you have any final comments, but just one point. I mean, we have over 250 advisory relationships that look like CalPERS, not as large as CalPERS, but many large state defined benefit pension funds, corporate funds, foundations, endowments. I mean, this is, as you know, the heart of what we do. We have received affirmative consents for just about all of those clients. We have engaged in conversations like this for many of those clients. I don't suggest that the challenges before you are not unique to you and are meaningful. And we have every expectation that you'll continue to do the diligence required. I just wanted to provide perhaps some comfort in the numbers that there is. We are largely, we have been engaging in this process, and there is a distinction between the consent process and the letter of the agreement. And I actually, just back to Mrs. Oliveris as well, that who raised an important question earlier. At the end of the day, I mean, we are fiduciaries. If we did anything to breach that, there is a contract in place, and so I'm just perhaps suggesting that there's two paths to be taken here. The consent and ongoing diligence will provide you with the materials from our third-party compliance consultant, as Mr. Jones and Mr. Rubalcaba had noted. There are many ways where we feel we can get you comfortable in the interest of full disclosure and the time associated to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, Director Perez.
I took some notes, and you just answered, Mr. Schwartz, you just answered one of them in regards to what your other clients have done. But adding to that, could we, not that I'm going to make the call, but if we needed to, could Matt and his team reach out to the other clients to figure out how they are dealing with this and how their staff or their general counsel is telling their board members that you're good to go?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, we would make any resources that make any connections to any clients, available to Mr. Jacobs or anybody else from the matter case.
And then I think, Matt, David asked this, but it was hard to hear. From the last RFP, when we did this, I know Makita had put in for it, but then who's left standing, or do we have to do a brand new RFP, or can we pull from that pool?
Well, one of my colleagues on the line will correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, you don't have to do an RFP. So somebody text me if I just got that wrong. But so so you could move to. I don't know who else had submitted and who else was deemed worthy of being interviewed. I don't have that information. Maybe Dan or Arnie does, but there are a variety of different ways to contract with somebody. But an excellent way, of course, is to do it through an RFP, and that's the way it has been done in the past, and it takes several months to do that. I'm not sure that answered your question, but if I didn't, give me another shot. Give me another chance.
No, you're fine. And so could we continue with Wilshire? And then if there's a real conflict, not just a whisper conflict, but a real conflict, can we, and I think you already talked about that, we can call in Makita to be a designated hitter on that? Or not really?
Well, subject to Makita's willingness to take that position and our ability to reach some kind of agreement as to what compensation they would require to do that.
But I'm sure that'd come out of Wilshire's chunk, right?
Yeah, that's when we get back to Ms. Brown's suggestion. Maybe they could hold us harmless on that.
Okay. Yeah, that was it.
Okay. President Jones.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Yeah. Let me be clear. If we were to sign the consent form, that doesn't lock us in any more than we are today, where we could still cancel in 10 days or 30 days, as you mentioned, Mr. Jacobs.
That's correct.
Okay. So, you know, still a lot of unanswered questions that I sense that, so we don't have to take action on this today, even though it's an action item. We could just continue down the path and continue to pursue, as both Matt and Ms. Dunnins indicated, until we have, I think Ms. Milton indicated, until we have Matt and Ms. Dunnin comfortable in terms of their advice on this after we continue to pursue the various other pieces of information.
We could, but let me ask Wilshire, do you need the board to take action on the consent today?
Jason, can I answer that?
Sure.
Because I think, you know, this is a technical question that I'm not sure anybody really has the answer to. What we need to understand is that the consent is not an endorsement of the transaction, number one. The consent does not change the contract in any way, so the same terms are there. Without the consent, in all honesty, what we are is sort of in a regulatory limbo. I don't know that this question has ever been raised or answered, either in any of the regulatory agencies that we are subject to. And so that's the difficulty. And so it almost raises more complications than makes things easier if we don't have the consent. Obviously, our fiduciary obligation continues, but the status of the contract comes into question at that point, and that becomes a complicating issue.
So what you're saying is you would prefer that we sign the consent?
I mean, if the intent is to move forward and give yourselves time, then yes, it creates greater clarity in the relationship than if we don't have the consent.
And I would just add one more, you know, it still creates the opportunity to have these discussions. As many of you noted, there's more questions perhaps than there are answers today. There are, you know, there are instances where, you know, folks, they sign the consent and then we'll continue to do that diligence. And, you know, there's times when, you know, I wouldn't volunteer this, but if you so choose to sort of put Wilshire on watch or to take the time to do the necessary diligence, you know, all of those opportunities are at your disposal. We remain fiduciaries in the, you know, in the meantime. This transaction hasn't closed. Nothing has changed. I do want to point out, you know, until you know, the end of the year.
Let me just make this point. Because I don't want the board to think that we're going to necessarily get answers, definitive answers, by extending this out. I mean, fundamentally, you're moving this. What this transaction does is it moves Wilshire. And let me tell you, I've got no questions about the integrity of these individuals or about Wilshire in general. I think, you know, echoing what other people have said from what I've observed, it's a great firm. And they would continue to have their fiduciary obligation, and that's a high obligation. But fundamentally, what you've got is you're moving from a firm that is independent right now, owned by its principals, to a firm that will be owned by private equity. And that perception, I don't know how we are. I mean, we can put, I guess that's the question for the board is, if you think you can get comfortable with that perception, then that's fine. Let's move forward and try and lock down some of these protocols and procedures. But if you can't, I mean, we're never, I guess what I'm saying is, I don't think we're ever going to be able to dispel that appearance. And that may not be fair. I'm happy to hear from Wilshire on it, but that's kind of, I just don't want us to go down this road to think that we're necessarily going to be able to resolve that issue.
Yeah. A question and then a comment. My question is, if we sign this today, basically we're just postponing making a decision, or does it actually make it any more or less difficult to sever a relationship? And then my comment is, from the viewpoint of our stakeholders, the perception of conflict, the perception of nefarious behavior, the perception of anything associated, the minute you say private equity with a lot of our stakeholders, they instantly, we have a perception issue and a hurdle to get over. And all this new additional potential for perceptions to reinforce them, to create new ones, all the baggage of additional administrative and legal and technical complications. I agree with you. I don't see how we have so many challenges with our stakeholders and the media and everything as it is. I don't see how we overcome this. But would signing this make it any harder to change direction, or are we just delaying making a decision?
Well, I don't think it would make it harder to make a decision down the road. The potential, the appearance, the conflicts trigger as soon as the deal closes and the ownership changes. But that aside, so you would be living with this at least perception until you make a decision. But that would be the only downside to continuing the relationship by signing the consent. Ms. Dunning looks like she's trying to jump in here.
Just a couple quick things. Thank you for saying that. One is that by signing the consent, I believe you are consenting to the transaction. So you're not consenting to engage in a relationship with not one who's not acting like a fiduciary, but you are consenting to the new ownership structure, at least for the duration of your relationship. That said, I was actually going to make a counterpoint to that, which is I wouldn't be so concerned about a perception of conflict that you do not believe is an actual conflict, that it deprives you of an outstanding investment consultant. So if your conclusion as fiduciaries is that you will get unconflicted, loyal and outstanding advice from Wilshire, the fact that there may be some members who look askance at private equity, I don't think that should be the driving force to have you not go forward with this. I think it really is important to try to stay above the fray to the extent that you can when assessing this arrangement and determining whether you should proceed with it or not.
Members of the board, you will be in good comfort if you reach that conclusion. There is not one client of Wilshire, not one, that has not provided consent because of this concern, not one. And so I'm not diminishing it. I'm not suggesting that it doesn't take time for you to get comfortable. I'm not suggesting, as Ms. Dunning noted, that the mere perception of conflict isn't a real thing. But all of our other clients have come to the conclusion that Wilshire, as a public servant, as a trusted fiduciary, as a thought leader to its clients, that has sufficient policies, procedures, and controls to address those, and our clients have reached that conclusion. And we'd love for you, for no other reason, to take the time to get there. If nothing else, out of a respect for a 35-year relationship, we would ask that much.
Okay, Ms. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. As most of you know, I strongly dislike the outrageous fees we pay to private equity. So I would be the last person to make the motion to approve the consent for this. So, and this is based upon the history with the firm, but also the work they have done for other board members, for myself as a brand new board member and ongoing. Their work they do for us is exceptional. I don't expect it to change. And I'm hoping that we can get a second and get a vote up or down. Thank you.
I will second it.
Okay, moved by Director Brown, seconded by President Jones. Any further discussion? Okay, I'll call for the question. Ms. Hopper, would you call the roll?
Margaret Brown.
Aye.
Rob Fechner.
Aye.
Henry Jones.
Aye.
Matthew Sehofer, Fiona Ma.
Muted, Matt.
Aye.
Okay. Lisa Middleton.
Aye.
David Miller.
Aye.
Stacy Oliveris. Stacy?
Sorry, no.
Elena Ortega.
Aye.
Jason Perez.
Aye.
Ramon Rubalcaba.
Yes.
Sonda Wesley.
I think she had to leave.
Okay. Betty Yee. Lynn Paquin for Betty Yee.
No.
Mr. Vice Chair, I have 9 yes, 2 noes. Noes were made from Stacy Oliveris and Lynn Paquin for Betty Yee. Motion was made by Margaret Brown. Henry Jones seconded.
Okay, and the motion passes. I guess it will be committee direction that I'm not sure quite how to put this, that we revisit this. It's not a final decision. It's just one step closer to a decision.
And let me just say, this is Tom with Wilshire. Thank you. We appreciate it, and we understand that there's more to do, and we have every intention of providing you all the information that you need to get comfortable. And even to Mr. Jacobs' point, is there a way to be 100% comfortable when it comes to perception? Perhaps not, but I can promise you that we are going to give you every bit of information that you need to adequately respond to your stakeholders to make them comfortable. So again, thank you.
Great, thank you all. I see no more requests to speak, so I guess we move to the next item, which is, I think, committee direction.
Sir, Mr. Vice Chair, and I have 2 committee directions that I took note of. The first is that in February, in addition to some of the educational work around the ALM, that we will bring a market update and the like to this group and other topical market issues. That way, it allows the board to do their oversight duty. The second one I got is that we will accelerate the every 5-year review of the divestment deep dive from November of next year to March of next year. So we'll bring that to this group in March. Those were the 2 committee directions that I had.
Sounds about right. Anybody? Okay. I think that is Henry.
I think we still would like to have some kind of forum to talk with their the firm ACA. I think I heard a number of board members like a better understanding of that relationship. So we should schedule that to have a follow-up.
Okay. Do you have that, Mr. Benvenuto?
I'm happy to add that as a third direction as a follow-up to understand the nature of the relationship with ACA.
If I may, what are the other, what is the rest of the direction with respect to further due diligence, if you will, on the Wilshire transition, ownership transition? Is there anything else?
I'm not quite sure. I mean, I don't know whether to ask for a recommendation or exactly. Ms. Middleton has her hand up. Do you have a thought?
I would thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I would like to have Mr. Jacobs and Ms. Dunning meet with Wilshire, explore some of the potentials for appearance of conflict, and come back and report to us as to how they will be resolved. And I see something along the lines of a memorandum that it defines what Wilshire's relationship will be when it comes to issues around private equity.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, and I just want to double check with Mr. Fox. It doesn't look like anybody wanted to weigh in from the public on these last items. Kind of surprises me, but is that correct, Mr. Fox?
Mr. Chair, we have one comment for the agenda item number 11, public comment. We have Alyssa Giacchino with the Private Equity Stakeholder Project.
Okay, well, I think we'll hear from her now.
Thank you, Kelly. Good evening, board members and staff. Alyssa Giacchino from the Private Equity Stakeholder Project. I want to give you an update on the ongoing issues with Leonard Green and Partners, safety net hospital chain Prospect Medical Holdings. As you recall, Leonard Green's aggressive gutting of Prospect and its hospitals has garnered substantial concern from workers, lawmakers, regulators, and investors across the country. At your September meeting, you heard from stakeholders in Connecticut, including from Ed Godomsky, a former IT tech whose entire department was outsourced just weeks after Prospect was approved for a large local tax break. Since then, there have been multiple noteworthy developments. An in-depth investigation of Prospect by ProPublica revealed a disturbing pattern of safety and quality issues at Prospect hospitals in every state the company operates, from California to Pennsylvania. The ProPublica revelations are numerous. I'll just note those uncovered at Prospect hospitals in California. 3 lawsuits have charged Prospect's Culver City Hospital with different allegations of billing fraud. One lawsuit alleged that special marketers for the hospital bussed in a stream of about 20 elderly patients a day, many suffering from dementia, and admitted them into the ER despite having no problems that required hospitalization. The litigation is pending in Los Angeles. Another suit alleged that the hospital inflated Medicaid revenues at its detox center. Prospect settled that suit in 2017. Last year, Attorney General Becerra formally charged Prospect executives with gross negligence related to persistent mold contamination of a hospital pharmacy, including an equipment used to mix patient medications. The pending Attorney General proceedings could revoke or suspend the hospital's pharmacy permit. At Prospect's flagship Los Angeles hospital, persistent elevator breakdowns sometimes require emergency room nurses to wheel patients on gurneys across a public street as security guard attempts to halt traffic. Regulators outside of California, regulators in Rhode Island recently extended their review process for Prospect's proposed change in ownership for a second time as they attempt to understand the puzzlingly low valuation the owners have assigned to the hospital company and the dividends paid out despite its deteriorating financial situation. The regulators' new deadline to approve this transaction is January 2021, over a year after Prospect first submitted its change in ownership application. Last month, at the New Mexico State Investment Council, the state's land commissioner, Stephanie Garcia Richard, raised concerns, saying that she will no longer support investments into Leonard Green until they answer for the problems at Prospect. The more we learn about Prospect Medical Holdings, the more disturbing this story becomes. And these problems are not going to go away, especially if Leonard Green continues to evade responsibility for the grave safety and quality concerns at its hospitals. Moreover, Leonard Green continues to justify its gutting of Prospect by touting its returns for investors like CalPERS. CalPERS should not feel comfortable being used as a shield for looting safety net hospitals. As one of Leonard Green's biggest investors, please stand up and ask them to return the dividends. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Mr. Potts, any other commenters for the public comment period?
No, Mr. Chair, that concludes public comment for today.
Okay, thank you. There's nothing left on our agenda, so I would, we don't have to do a motion to adjourn, do we? Nope, okay, so I would say, hearing no objection, we're adjourned.